Okay, welcome everybody at this ECE Talks webinar on rare diseases, namely hypothalamic obesity, which is a joint webinar from the ESE, EndoRN, and SP. We are currently live. We will start in approximately 1 minute. My name is Jonathan Mertens. I'm a resident at the University Hospital of Antwerp, the Department of Endocrinology. I'm also a PhD candidate in the Laboratory of Experimental Medicine and Pediatrics of the University of Antwerp. I'm a board member of the ESE committee within ESE, the European Young Endocrine Scientists. And I'm very honored to be able to chair this session today. The session will be approximately 1 hour in length, including the presentations and the time for the questions from the audience. For the audience, please ask all questions throughout the session using the question and ask box at the bottom of the screen. If someone experiences technical difficulties, please message the ECE team using the chat box. The session will be recorded and it will be available on the ECE website as soon as possible after the session has concluded, approximately a couple of weeks. It is now time to introduce our first speaker. The first speaker is Professor Dr. Ulrich Dischinger. Professor Dischinger works as a senior physician and a scientist at the Department of Endocrinology at the University Hospital of Würzburg in Germany. He studied medicine at the University of Graz in Austria and did his diploma thesis on the hormonal aspects of food intake and examining an antagonist of the NPY-Y2 receptor. In his PhD thesis, he investigated the effects of different early life housing conditions on gene expression in brain areas associated with resilience and food intake. His scientific focus developed towards the treatment of obesity and its comorbidities, with strong financial support of the EZKF Würzburg, leading to his habilitation in 2023 German promotion. Dr. Dischinger aims to elucidate the relevance of GLP-1 and PYY in the search of an effective medical gastric bypass with analogues of these incretins. His research showed that the integrity of the hypothalamus is very relevant for the effects of bariatric surgery, underlining its great significance for food intake regulation. The focus of his work group that he leads lies on the most relevant comorbidities of obesity, namely MASLD, steatohepatitis, and heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, mainly in animal models. He is a co-author of over 40 papers, and he will now address the general aspects of hypothalamic obesity. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thanks for letting me have my talk about the hypothalamus, actually. I will bring some basic information about hypothalamic function and what it does. This very interesting and surprising organ or part of the brain, and at least some clinical aspects from our research. I'm quite sure that Hanneke will bring much more information regarding clinical aspects, so I will not go into much detail here. But first of all, let me show you my conflicts of interest as it is done. Nothing of this is interacting with the slides I have. When we talk about the hypothalamus, we have to start with the gut-brain axis. The gut-brain axis is generally our concept, or the mostly accepted concept, so to say, for the idea how gut and brain communicate. So to some extent, of course, we have to, our brain has to know when our gut has gotten enough, so to say. So there's a strong communication between these two huge and for our well-being very relevant organs. This gut-brain axis goes, of course, in both directions. For now, the direction I will focus on is the one from the gut to the brain, which is here in the left, as you can see, at the part where gut hormones are secreted, mostly from the duodenum, but also the colon and other gastrointestinal organs. And via the bloodstream, the circulation, they reach the effector organs, mainly via different intestinal organs, but also, and very relevantly, the hypothalamus. And actually, there's a different second concept how gut and brain interact, which I will not go into much detail here because it's not hypothalamus specific, so to say. And this is going via microbiota and the neurotransmitters these microbiota produce, and in some way they, via the vagus nerve, enter our brain as well. But we will focus on the gut hormone, gut-brain axis part. So that's what I'm talking about. Which kind of hormones from the gut are interesting in this setting? Actually, there are lots of course. There are many hormones which we probably do not know of right now, but at least there are some hormones. I want to go into more detail here. You see from the stomach, for example, we get ghrelin and gastrin as really relevant gastrointestinal hormones. From the pancreas, of course, you all know insulin, glucagon. From the duodenum, mainly from duodenum, but also parts of the colon, we get very interesting hormones. I will focus on in my talk GLP-1, GIP, PYY336. These are all hormones which are for our food intake behavior very, very relevant. And not only that, all of these hormones are part of glucose homeostasis to some extent, at least, are part of nutrient absorption, energy mobilization, and nevertheless, the most interesting part for satiety and feeding behavior. If we go into more details regarding GLP-1 and GIP and PYY, three very relevant gastrointestinal hormones from the duodenum, mainly from L cells from duodenum, we can think of many organs where these hormones have some kinds of effects. Just to give you some impression, I put three here. The heart, for one example, is an organ very relevant for several reasons to us. I do not have to go into detail here, I think, where receptors for GLP-1, but also GIP, but also PYY are expressed, and we do not really know what their meaning is. In the liver, the same. There are receptors for these peptide hormones, which have different effects and aspects, which I do not go into detail here. But the thing we focus today on is the hypothalamus as part of the brain, where all of these hormones can have effects. There are receptors for all of these hormones, and this makes the hypothalamus a very complicated region. Receptors in different areas and in different nuclei. And in the end, we have, well, this is only a scheme, of course, of the hypothalamus, a thick schematic version. We have nuclei and areas that interact in different ways, in quite complicated ways we do not understand to full extent. The most relevant part of the hypothalamus would be in my opinion at least, the nucleus arcuatus, the arcuate nucleus, where neurons expressing POMC and neurons expressing NPY or butyryl peptide are interacting to some extent. But as you can see here in the scheme, you see that, for example, POMC, but also NPY expressing neurons express also receptors for peripheral hormones. So the task of the hypothalamus is obviously to integrate information from the periphery, from the duodenum in this example, and make something out of this. This is what the hypothalamus does. It does not think by itself, but it integrates information. And I'll focus on the part where it integrates information from the gastrointestinal system, namely from the duodenum in this example, leading to some kind of hormonal answer. So POMC and MPY expressing neurons do not only interact with each other, but they also interact with other brain and hypothalamus areas. And this whole picture makes the hypothalamus itself the main structure, or at least one of the main structures for food intake regulation. So you can have, I think, a clue what happens if the hypothalamus is not working. Then we do not have the adequate integration of information from the periphery, and our central regulation of food intake is not working, meaning in the end, we do not have satiety, for an example. We do not have the feeling of fullness. of gastrointestinal, now it's enough. We can't experience this kind of feeling if we come to the strongest extent, so to say. But only for the sake of completeness, I want to add that of course, GLP-1 does much more than only work in the hypothalamus. It works on the heart, on the kidney, on the pancreas, in the gastrointestinal tract, in many organs where GLP-1 and also GLP-1 analogs, you probably all know of semaglutide and liraglutide, and all of these are part of the media at the moment to a very high extent. And all of these medications or pharmaceuticals, but also GLP-1 itself, work not only on the hypothalamus, but also on the heart, helping us, for example, in heart failure patients, improving morbidity and mortality. For PYY, another hormone coming from the duodenum, from enteroendocrine L cells, being transferred to PYY 336, the active form, via DPP4. For PYY, our knowledge is not that good, and we do not have medication at the moment. Unfortunately, I think personally, but there are some difficulties. And one of them is that PYY, for example, also works in the brain, also in the hypothalamus. But as you might remember, I didn't, I said it before, the hypothalamus itself is, of course, a very complicated structure, and PYY is able to bind to several receptors there, not only NPY, also NPY2, NPY1, NPY5 receptors. And in the end, they are a little bit different in what they have, what effects they have. Mainly, PYY 336 acts on NPY2 receptors, leading to increased satiety and reduced food intake. So this is a maybe very strong cut now from just physiological aspects to a clinical problem. A patient from our department, actually a long time before, but that's not the point here, with high grade of obesity, obviously, with more than 200 kilograms of body weight. At this point, speaking of a very sick patient, of course, which we have to treat to some extent, and the most effective possibility to treat such a patient is bariatric surgery at the moment. If we talk about bariatric surgery, this is some kind of different in the world, in the different countries, which form of bariatric surgery is the preferred one. Mainly, there are two different forms: Roux-en-Y gastric bypass and sleeve gastrectomy. They are a little bit different in the surgical intervention itself. So let's just focus on one: Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, the gold standard, so to say, for bariatric surgery. Actually, probably for a surgeon, which I am not, so I can't be sure entirely be sure. This is not a very complicated intervention, but a very strong one. Actually, anatomically, you do just the following. You put the duodenum straight to the upper part of the stomach, which lets the food just pass the stomach and go straightly to the duodenum. Stomach is not part of the digestion anymore, so to say. And this leads to a very interesting fact, namely that patients which underwent bariatric surgery develop from the first day on. So from the day of surgery on, changed food preference. They lower their food intake. And this is due to, which has been shown several times, so this is at the moment accepted, which is due to high postprandial levels of hormones, as I talked about, that are able to influence our food intake in a way that they induce satiety and lower food intake behavior, namely PYY, GLP-1, GIP, and others. All of these hormones are known to be elevated after food intake in patients that underwent bariatric surgery. So it's a very interesting intervention. Actually, it's an endocrine surgery, so to say, because the main fact of this kind of intervention is an endocrine change, a hormonal change, which leads in the end to strong effects on body weight. As we see here, weight change in surgical intervention patients is more than 30% body weight loss. So that's quite extensive, of course, and we are not able to imitate this at the moment with any drug, not even tirzepatide, the strongest anti-obesity drug in the moment, which is a combination of GLP-1 and GIP, is not as good as bariatric surgery. So it's the strongest intervention we can do for reducing body weight. Not only that, it's obviously also the best option to treat diabetes, because always the type 2 diabetes, if you lose body weight, of course, your diabetes gets better and so on and so on. This is also accepted. Now, getting back to the hypothalamus, we did a interesting, in my opinion at least, research some years before, where we had standard Vista rats fed with a high-fat diet to a point where they got obese, and then we randomized them into different treatment groups. One of them being gastric bypass surgery, another a combination or a monotherapy with PYY, which I talked about, and liraglutide, which is an older GLP-1 agonist. And after an additional 4 weeks after treating, we took their brains out and took a look at the hypothalami of these animals. Here's just the weight curve of these animals. So what we can see is the black curve, the bariatric surgery animals. Of course, they have the strongest body weight loss. And our combination with medical treatment is at least similar effective. There's no statistical difference. But let's take a look at the hypothalamus. What happens here is, just focus on this left plot. This are data from RNA sequencing from the hypothalamus, where we see that gastric bypass leads to many, many differentially regulated genes. So many of them, the red ones, being significantly upregulated. And our medical treatments, neither the PYY alone, nor liraglutide alone, nor the combination, all of them, they do not lead to any change on an hypothalamic level. This is quite interesting, and once again underscores the importance of the hypothalamus for effective obesity treatment. If we take a closer look, this is just for your information. Of course, we can do bioinformatical stuff and statistics and much more. We see that many genes which code for receptors that are very interesting for food intake regulation are higher regulated or upregulated in animals that underwent gastric bypass surgery. So the problem now is there are individuals in the world, and in our center we treat some. I think Hanneke has a big experience in this field, that develop some kind of hypothalamic obesity. And why do they do that? For example, this is only an example, they have some kind of disease that's called craniopharyngioma. This is a generally benign tumor, which is mostly or often located in the brain area of the hypothalamus. What we can see here is an MRI of a patient with craniopharyngioma. In this area, the hypothalamus is placed normally, and this actually benign tumor is now destroying the hypothalamus. This is a big problem for the patient, because what he or she develops is a disease called hypothalamic obesity. So these patients get thick, they do not have satiety anymore. The hypothalamus as the integrating factor in the brain, which gets signals from the duodenum, from other organs, is not working anymore. And what can we do with these patients? Of course, if they have hypothalamic obesity, we have to help them, we have to treat them. We did a study in the past looking at the weight loss or weight course of patients with hypothalamic obesity. That's this group that underwent bariatric surgery. And what we can see is rather depressing, actually, that in these patients, our normally very strong surgical intervention is not that strong. So if we compare them to normal, there's no thing like normal, but just you see the things here, to our normal obese patients that underwent bariatric surgery, there's a big, big difference. This is quite depressing, of course, and they do not have an effect as we want them to have. Their feeling of hunger is still high after surgery, so they do not have beneficial effects of the surgery. And this, although they have a very strong endocrine answer to food intake, which is shown here. And these curves show GLP-1 and this PYY courses over 60 minutes after intake of a well-defined food proportion. And we see that this group, the hypothalamic obese patients with bariatric surgery, have actually very high GLP-1 and PYY levels after food intake. But of course, due to the fact that their hypothalamus is destroyed or not working anymore in the end, they do not have an answer. So they can't integrate the signal. They can't translate this into less feeding food intake and to increase satiety. That's the main problem of these patients. And just as some kind of conclusion, the time is already run up. What will be the future of general obesity treatment? Of course, these hypothalamic obese patients, they are a special group, a very sensitive group. For general obesity, this concept that the hypothalamus is obviously integrating signals is very convenient, because now we can try and build medications that are based on gastrointestinal hormones that are known to work in the hypothalamus. PYY, GLP-1 is already on the market, but there are many peptide hormones from the gastrointestinal tract that come into mind here. And of course, the big companies, I'm quite sure, are working on this topic strongly. Although for our hypothalamically obese patients, these kind of medications might not be that good, or that might not help them to an extent that we can help them enough. That's a big problem. There's some kind of shining on the horizon, so to say. I think Hanneke will tell you about this, but at the moment, that's where we stand. So I think the 20 minutes are done. So thank you very much from the Würzburg team, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much for this very, very interesting and cohesive talk. I will go into the chat box at the moment, so people feel free to send in while they are typing. I have a question on my own. I think the key phrase that you mentioned is the hypothalamus as a target, especially when it is destroyed. And I'm probably going a little bit into the waters of Professor Van Santen, maybe. But we talk now at a lot of endocrine-orientated pharmacotherapeutics. Are there also other options that we can take into account?
You mean for a patient with hypothalamic obesity?
Yes, like neural stimulation, or to work on the hypothalamus, but without endocrine pharmaceuticals.
I think, and Hanneke, please correct me if I'm wrong, we're not nearly there regarding this problem, but that's generally a very good idea, of course. I think regarding my hope is not that big that I could say, yeah, that's a big option, because in the end, just one more thing, the point about the hypothalamus is, of course, patients with hypothalamic obesity would be very different. So hypothalamic obesity is an individual disease. The image I showed you from the MRI from the patient with a relatively large craniopharyngioma is, of course, not the standard case. And if you think back to the slides I showed you about the complexity of the hypothalamus, then it might be very, very relevant if one develops the full-blown phenotype or not, which parts of the hypothalamus are indeed damaged. And this is, of course, hard to say only from an MRI scan. That's a very big problem, I think, also in research, because in the end, from an MRI scan, you can't always be sure which parts of the hypothalamus are now entirely destroyed, which are now still working maybe. And for any kind of, let's say, a more intensive intervention. This information, in my opinion, would be crucial. So this stays a big, I don't think that's really realistic. Yeah.
Okay. In the meantime, the questions are getting in. I've got one asking, are there any ghrelin hormones considered for hypothalamic obesity treatment?
Not as far as I know, because with ghrelin treatment, it's not that simple. So we do not have, to my knowledge, we do not have medication with ghrelin at the moment.
Okay. I got another one asking, is functional MRI a future option? I guess that's going about the diagnostics question that we were discussing.
Yes, we did a
Before.
study.
Yeah.
Actually, this is a good question. Part of this sub-study of this craniopharyngoma study I showed you with the big question is, I only talked about communication between duodenum and hypothalamus for now. Of course, there is a big point which I didn't touch now because in 20 minutes it's hard to say everything, but the brain is more complex than just the hypothalamus. And of course, we have something like limbic system and some kind of hedonic behavior. So in the end, a big question will be, can we maybe interact with this system? And the functional MRI might help you there, help us there. And we tried back then, we tried with our patients to see if at least the bariatric surgery did something about the hedonic system, showing them different pictures of different food stuff and so on and so on. Well, there was a big difference back there, so I didn't show you this data. But in the end, of course, it's an idea, but this is for a scientific setting. So for a general diagnostic setting, the functional MRI is too complicated. It has to be standardized. You have to show standardized pictures or images of things which you can compare to a healthy population and so on. It's unfortunately not that simple. Yeah.
Okay. We have another one of a colleague documenting that they have seen very severe weight loss in children with seizures during topiramate treatment. Is it possible to use this drug in monogenic obesity, for example, Lawrence-Moon-Bardell-Beadle syndrome, Prader-Willi syndrome, or hypothalamic obesity without seizures? And I think the question is specifically aimed at the pediatric population.
So Hanneke, feel free to.
Hi, thanks. So I don't have any experience with this drug for the indication of hypothalamic obesity to be. So I don't think that we should use this drug for this indication.
And we have alternatives, right? So I think this is, yeah.
Okay. This one I find myself also very interesting. Is there an AI approach to predicting hypothalamic obesity after pituitary for hypothalamic surgery?
Not to my knowledge, although this would be
Good
very
question.
interesting. Yeah, this is a very good question. Although the problem doesn't end at the surgery. So the surgeon is not the only person that makes the damage, but there's in hypothalamic obesity due to craniopharyngioma. There's a second problem. Many of these patients at some point have some kind of radiation. So stereotactic or not, they have some additional damage to this area. And in the end, I think it gets quite complicated to take all of these factors into one pot and make something out of this. This is you need a really great artificial intelligence for this. I think this is not that easy. Yeah.
Okay, and I think perfectly on time for one final question, which is here: is leptin resistance implicated in reduced satiety signaling?
Yeah, in the end, of course, leptin receptor deficiency is a huge problem for satiety. So that's what the patients, manifest with oftentimes.
Okay. I think that's everything in the Q&A box. I think this can lead us to the second speaker now. I'll just wait 5 more seconds to see if something pops in. No. Okay. Thank you very, very much.